Okay. Good morning. It is 10:50 a.m. on Wednesday, April 6th, and we are resuming the second half of Senate Natural Resources and Energy's morning session. We're resuming our work on H466 and activating to surface water withdrawals and interbasin transfers. We're going to start out with, based on testimony we've taken in the past, I sat down with Mr. O'Grady and asked to have an amendment drafted that would make a first start at responding to the concerns we heard expressed. And so I'd ask Mr. O'Grady to lead off by walking us through that language and helping us understand how it fits into the existing bill. Thank you.
So this is Mike O'Grady with the Office of Legislative Counsel. Just to refresh your memory about the basic requirements of H466. Beginning January 1, 2023, any person withdrawing 5,000 gallons or more of surface water within a 24-hour period shall register with the Secretary. And then beginning on January 1, 2023, there will be an annual report required for those persons that are withdrawing more than 5,000 gallons or more over surface water from a surface water within a 24-hour period. And then by July of 2026, the agency is required by rule to stand up a permitting program for withdrawal from surface waters, provided that they will establish a threshold limit for permitting in that rule. Prior to the rulemaking, as part of the reporting requirement, there are provisions as to how a person will report, and that is what the amendment addresses. So first, in the first instance of amendment, you should have both a hard copy in front of you, and then there's an electronic copy on the committee page, and Jude has it posted behind me. The subsection regarding methods of reporting is struck, and in its place is the language in front of you. The first thing that's done is that there's an exception, and ultimately it's going to be exception for agricultural reporting, but except as provided in subdivision 2, the following method shall be used to report the amounts of withdrawn surface water required to be reported under subsection B of the section. Withdrawals of between 5,000 and 50,000 gallons of surface water per day, averaged over any 30-day period in a year, shall either provide an estimate of total volume withdrawn or provide meter data. And then for withdrawals of more than 50,000 gallons of surface water per day, averaged over any 30-day period in a year, shall provide meter data or measured data by a technically appropriate method approved by the Secretary. And then you get to that exception for the type of reporting. So withdrawals for irrigation or watering of livestock of more than 5,000 gallons of surface water per day, average over any 30-day period in a year, may provide an estimate of the total volume withdrawn based on log records maintained by the person withdrawing the surface water. So I'm going to stop there to see if you have any questions.
That's just a raw measure of water. It's not like water per acre that it's applied to or anything like that.
That is not what the language says. It's just what is coming out of the intake effectively as logged by that person that's irrigating or watering livestock.
Okay. I'm just thinking for I'm trying to figure out how much water we're talking about, what this looks like. And I know this has been discussed already, but you know, I'm just thinking, for example, my well draws 3 gallons a minute. That comes out as 4,320 gallons a day. So I'm in the neighborhood, you know.
I've heard testimony that 5,000 gallons is approximately the size of a small fuel truck. If that helps at all.
Yeah. And we do have Mr. Rich back from the Fruit and I have the name right, Fruit and Berry Association. He was one of our witnesses earlier. We talked about the implications of the bill, so we can get back to him as well. Senator Campion?
So just big picture on this, we're really just having them kind of do back of the envelope estimates that they would submit. Is that accurate?
Well, for non-agricultural uses under 50, they do an estimate or they provide the meter data.
Okay.
For over 50 non-agricultural, they have to provide meter data or other technically approved method approved by the secretary. For ag, for irrigation and watering of livestock, it is, I was told that you were told that they keep a log record of their daily irrigation and that they should be able to calculate or estimate from their log records how much gallonage is removed. And so that's what agriculture, irrigation and watering of livestock will be based on log records maintained by the person drawing the surface water.
Yes, so do dairies generally, do they use surface waters?
From my knowledge, they generally use groundwater,
Right.
but I expect that there are probably a few that
Okay.
use irrigation. And it's not just cows, it's livestock, so.
All sorts of things. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
If I, think about this practically, so when I was on the horse farm, you would be taking 4 5-gallon buckets a day to the horses, and you could just 20 gallons times 25 horses, and you'd know your approximate water use.
But remember, the livestock drinking directly from the surface water is exempt.
Okay.
Constructed ponds that don't have a connection to surface water are also exempt. Meaning
Animals don't drink directly out of the waters.
They're not supposed to.
I don't know of any farm that is allowed in a stream or in a pond. And you have to, best management practice has to be followed. And if you have any fences, you have to fence off a certain number of feet from the stream. And not that, so nobody drinks directly out of a stream or a brook.
They're not supposed to, under the RAPs, they're supposed to not trample the stream bank and they're supposed to be fenced out of the water. But the bill does address direct watering, and it does say that direct watering is not subject to the withdrawal provisions.
So, Mr. Chair, I guess this is a question for you, since you're proposing it. Why did you put the livestock piece in? What got you there?
I'm trying to remember I don't remember off the top of my head who we were speaking with.
Okay.
At the time it was, here are legitimate uses for water, and people have an idea of, because it requires time, effort, money in some cases to do this, people have a sense of what kind of water use they have based on their own practices. So if they have that knowledge, then, and they can record it, and then just once a year file, a summary document, whatever it is.
Sure.
Then we have a way for them to contribute to the development of a better map of water use in the state without having them incur equipment expenses. There will be some time and effort, but it's my understanding that people, they know their operation well enough to know how much water, roughly at least, they're going to be using. For instance, we heard we don't want to overwater a crop because that's not healthy for the crop. So we'll be cognizant of how long we water and the rate of use per minute that we water, that kind of thing. So we'll hear more from Mr. Rich, but that was the idea, provide a low, no cost solution to providing data to the state.
Should I move on to the second instance of amendment?
Everyone,
Yeah.
ready? Okay, thank you.
So I believe you heard some concerns from the agency, the Association of General Contractors and potentially from the Agency of Transportation relating to the fact that they need to withdraw water under federal requirements for dust suppression and other provisions of highway infrastructure projects. And they were concerned that if they had to apply for a permit for each withdrawal, that it would be burdensome and would delay infrastructure projects. So what the second instance of amendment does is the agency was given discretion to adopt general permits, but they would still have that discretion, but they would also then have a mandatory requirement to issue a general permit for the withdrawal of surface water for state or municipal infrastructure projects. And that general permit shall establish withdrawal volumes that only require notification of the secretary and do not require approval prior to withdrawal. So frankly, it would probably set conditions on withdrawal. So probably some basic flow requirements for low flow and prohibitions on withdrawal from low flow, and then a report to the secretary on what was withdrawn when and where. And I don't, if that is the general structure, I don't think it would have a burden on or delay a project. It would just be some additional paperwork for the project to file.
And conceivably, if since it's A&I that is doing the water quality work, water volume and quality work in general in this bill, and they're writing the rule, and I would imagine they would have the discretion, and I would imagine they would use it to have some sort of basic reporting so that they would have a sense of what those water quality impacts might be, complete ground data. That's it. Those were the two areas where.
There's one more amendment.
All right.
And that is prior to Administrative Procedure Act rulemaking, so formal rulemaking and the public participation that's required under that formal rulemaking, there would be a section that would be added that would require the secretary to conduct public input and outreach with interested parties prior to initiating formal rulemaking. So during the pre-rulemaking process, to engage the public in setting up the requirements for the surface water permitting program.
And that's for the program overall. We're not just talking about the preceding section.
Right, it's for the program overall.
Thank you for that. I forgot about that request. So that's it. Those were three areas to tune the bill. I guess we'll hear from interested parties to see whether or not they think we addressed their concerns. Any questions from Mr. O'Grady before we lose him?
I'm just going to walk over there.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Right. Thank you, Rob. With that, go back to our Zoom guests and go to Mr. Rich. So good morning, Mr. Rich. Thanks for testifying before. Thanks for your written comments following that visit with us. And thanks for reviewing the amendment prior to coming in this morning. So I guess our question is pretty simple. If we found a solution to your concerns, or does it need further work?
Thank you for hearing me again. I did review the amendment from yesterday, and overall, I'd say it made a huge improvement. But I would, if it would be all right, could we actually hear Mr. Patch from the Agency of Ag speak before? Because I don't want to tread over something less elegantly than he will. That way, if he addresses half of my points, I can just say I agree or disagree. Would that be acceptable to the committee?
Sure, we're always flexible on that stuff. So let's jump into Mr. Patch, who also taking a look. Good morning, thanks for coming back. So, yeah, same question. Did we is the amendment propose a solution that addresses agency's concerns over the earlier draft?
Thank you, Chair Bray. For the record, Ryan Patch, Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. I have submitted proposed language and comments to the committee assistant and would be happy to discuss those with the committee this morning. One of the 3 points that was raised in agency testimony when I was here back in March, one of them was concern over the cost of requiring metering for farms that are withdrawing a de minimis amount. And insofar as the proposal that was shared yesterday creates a separate category for what I understand to be agricultural withdrawals, irrigation and watering of livestock, having a separate way to keep records and submitting that usage as a way to satisfy the reporting requirement. I think that does address one of the agency's concerns, and we certainly appreciate that proposed amendment.
Okay. Mr. Patch, we just got your electronic document, so we're not able to see it. If you have access to it right there, if you went to screen sharing, we could look at the other portions. That would be helpful.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to do so as soon as I get permission to share my screen. There we go. Great. So there exist 2 concerns that the agency has regarding how surface water is defined and what that means for existing agricultural use. The first section here, section 1002, which provides the definition of surface water, creates an interrelated reference where we think that simpler language could be used to describe what is a constructed farm pond that is off stream, and how that is not a surface water, and the intent of the language is to exclude those farm reservoirs, those farm ponds that are not surface waters, without getting into the nuance of the fact that a impoundment, a dam, if you will, of a spring or other wet area on a farm that, for example, was built in 1955 by the Soil Conservation Service or a conservation district, someone with a backhoe going around digging farm ponds many years ago, that, while it may have an outlet, it is not perhaps intended to be subject to the Vermont water quality standards. And so I'll talk about that in a moment. What I wanted to bring the committee's attention to first is around the definition of surface water as proposed within this draft. What I see this definition, yes.
Can you zoom it one step larger, please?
Apologies.
Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
That's the totality of this section here. To dig into what I'm going to talk about are 3 different definitions that exist in Title 10 and in different chapters. Chapter 47, 10 VSA section 1251, sub 13 is waters. And that's generally the definition you see in the H.466 as passed by the House. It does add, all bodies of surface waters. The next area where there are definitions are, Chapter 48, which defines groundwater. And there's 2 definitions of groundwater found in Chapter 48, 10 VSA 1391 and 10 VSA 1416. The definition of groundwater that I will put up on the screen here, and I apologize that it's a lot of words, but I just wanted to pull them out as they're found on the General Assembly website, which includes the first one. Groundwater means water below the land surface, but does not include surface waters within the meaning of subdivision 1251.13. The second definition of groundwater means water below the land surface, including springs. And so when you get to H466 as passed by the House, it puts springs in here in the definition of surface water, where in the groundwater section, springs are defined as groundwater. And so where groundwater has been excluded from being a surface water is defined at 1391, perhaps 1416 is a better place to reference groundwater, which excludes springs, which comes from the groundwater withdrawal program. And since this surface water withdrawal section is focusing on surface water withdrawals, the distinction here is those areas of farms where a farmer set a well tile long ago and collects groundwater in a spring tile, and there's an overflow. That collection system, even if it is dug as an example as a pond, as a farm pond, and as a way to collect that groundwater into a more usable reservoir so it can be used in times of drought, that is the type of on-farm infrastructure that the agency feels is intended to be excluded in the last part of the definition of surface water in H466. Shall not include the following: constructed farm ponds or other impoundments that are used for irrigation or watering of livestock. And so that confusion of spring as a groundwater source and an off-stream constructed farm pond as being an area where water is collected from groundwater or stormwater, perhaps, I'm not sure, but where the withdrawal of that is not intended to be subject to the surface water withdrawal registration, reporting, or permitting requirements. And so these are some language changes the agency is putting forward the committee for consideration.
Okay, thanks. Let's pause there for just a moment because we still have council with us. Mr. O'Grady, do you want to offer a comment, or we can wait till you've had a study what Mr. Patch suggested? Your choice.
I'm looking at the surface water group's report. I thought they addressed why they included springs. And it was for the basis of mapping the withdrawals for those under the 57,500 or the 20,000 based on the groundwater program. But I'm not finding that here. Maybe that was just testimony that I heard.
Okay, so.
But I think for purposes of clarity and regulation, it's not a bad distinction, but you would not be getting information on springs, withdrawal from springs that are below the groundwater thresholds.
Okay. All right, so thanks for flagging this stuff.
But I do have on the farm ponds and striking that are not subject to the Vermont water quality standards. There can be constructed farm ponds with connections to surface waters, natural surface waters, both inflow and outflow. And if that means they're subject to the Vermont water quality standards, then they are surface waters. But by striking that, you're basically going to create confusion about those constructed farm ponds, whether they are subject to this program or
not. Thank you. Mr. Patch, anything in response to Mr. O'Grady's point?
Sure, I'll address that. I think both an inflow and an outflow and an impoundment is a dam, perhaps. Could look at it that way, compared to a infield or edge of field dug and constructed pond, which is charged by groundwater and where there is a discharge point. And attempting to distinguish those two is the intent of striking that. And it's not the Agency of Agriculture to define what the Vermont Water Quality Standards applies to, and so it may be useful to check in with DEC about how that could be applied and how clarity could be reached between those groundwater charged ponds that I think the agency and the intent of the study committee, I'll just speak for the agency, having those excluded makes sense. Where there is inflow and outflow, that's likely clearly a surface water and would be subject to reporting and registration requirements if there's withdrawals above certain thresholds and perhaps permitting. So just those site-specific questions, I think, can be addressed with the language as proposed. But again, that's just the agency perspective, agency of ag.
Right, thank you. So we'll go on, and I think we'll hear again from Mr. Crocker, who chaired that working group. So we won't be voting this today. I think there's enough still cooking that we need to sort it out. But let's send it to Donald, and then we'll go forward with Mr. Patch's testimony.
So how is the transition from groundwater to streams, which I always thought were called springs? Where do they fall in this definition of waters?
What they're proposing will be covered by the groundwater withdrawal program and not by the surface water program. And what's in front of you, springs, will be covered by the surface water program for the purposes of registration and reporting. But you don't know if they would be covered underneath the permitting program, because the permitting program has not been established.
So for the purpose of statute, the thing called the spring doesn't exist? Or?
No, it exists. There's two definitions of groundwater. One does not include springs and one does. And the bill as passed by the House used the one that does not include springs, and therefore defines surface water to include springs. What the Agency of Agriculture is proposing is to change the definition of groundwater so it includes the one that does include springs, and to exclude springs from the definition of surface water, the surface water registration and reporting requirements.
I'm lost. My next question was going to be tile drains, which has the same challenge in finding, even though one is manufactured and the other one is natural. But I'm lost. So. Maybe I'll catch up here.
Okay, well, how about for Mr. O'Grady, another bite at the apple? I mean, it's more than one way to say all these things. So you could just repeat that distinction. It's sort of that.
There are two definitions of groundwater in the groundwater chapter. One is basically for policy of the state and the protection of groundwater, and it does not include springs. There is another definition regarding the groundwater withdrawal program, and that does include springs. So if you exceed the thresholds for reporting or permitting under the groundwater withdrawal permitting program from a spring, you have to report or get a permit underneath the groundwater withdrawal program. H466, as passed by the House, uses the definition of groundwater that does not include springs, and instead includes springs under the surface water definition, so that people withdrawing from springs in excess of 5,000 gallons would be reporting and registering that for the purpose of inventorying withdrawals from springs. But the permit could exclude withdrawals from springs, because that is part of the authority of the agency to establish the permit program.
The Agency of Agriculture. Yeah.
The Agency of Natural Resources.
The Agency of Natural Resources. So,
well, Senator McCormick, then Senator Westman.
How on earth do we operate under two definitions? I guess, how does one know which definition to use?
Because it says in this subchapter, you use this definition, and in the other one, it says in this subchapter, you use this definition.
And which subchapter has which definition?
The subchapter on withdrawal has the definition that includes springs. The subchapter on policy has the definition that excludes springs.
How do the cows know which one's which?
So,
Wow.
so we're trying to inventory withdrawals. So
Well, you have to think about why policy excludes springs, because springs come to the surface, and when they come to the surface, they are now a public trust resource under the Constitution, right? And then you think about why springs were included in the withdrawal program, because there were people withdrawing right at the source of the spring. So it was if they had moved their intake just a few feet, they probably would have been groundwater, but they were withdrawing from the source of the spring and bottling that. And so,
Groundwater is public trust as well now. We passed that a few years ago.
right, and that's under the policy section. So it's groundwater, public trust until it comes to the surface, and then it's surface water, public trust once it hits the surface.
So,
But it's always subject to regulation. It's public trust.
Not necessarily. So the groundwater that's below the surface and below the reporting or permitting thresholds is not subject to regulation.
It's just a public trust.
It's subject to public trust, and then the activity that might affect it is what's regulated. That's the groundwater protection rule.
Well, we never actually regulate water. We regulate activities pertaining to water. When do we regulate water?
You regulate water for surface water.
1984. How so? I mean, we regulate what we do
You
with water.
regulate the flow of water. That is not an activity,
By building dams?
or its flow and how it affects aquatic and riparian
1985.
species. You do regulate
Well,
flow.
we don't tell the water what it can and can't do. We tell people what they can and can't do to the flow of the water.
You also regulate flow for the purpose of stormwater management. You do regulate flow.
How do we regulate flow exclusive of regulating people?
But rain comes off
Can give me a
land that's developed or undeveloped and can affect the flow of a water. And the stormwater TMDLs are flow management TMDLs.
Yeah, they regulate what people do to the water.
No, they
So
regulate the
maximum thing-
flow. And then there's a stormwater management manual that regulates what the people do.
Are you familiar with the legend of King Canute? That's what this sounds like.
so, Senator, I'm conscious of time as well.
It's interesting.
So Senator Westman, and then let's continue, because I don't know how many more edits are gonna be. proposed.
Forgive my back, that's not a
No.
no comment.
Well, when I look at this, and this may be for Ryan or whoever, when I look at this, when I see rivers, streams, creeks, brooks, reservoirs, ponds, lakes, all of those have a potential for surface flow. A spring, very rarely does a spring that someone has on, and I'll go on our farm because we always had a spring. It doesn't come to the surface and it doesn't flow like a stream or brook. So in that, from a practical sense, I see a difference. And I can understand in the statute why there is one of both, But in this case, if what we're trying to do is measure flows, I'm not, for me, I don't know if springs fit that well, but that I would ask you or Ryan to comment on, because I think it gets to the question of flow.
I think this is basically the conversation that was had when the groundwater withdrawal permit program was set up. Like, where do you draw the line? And is a spring surface water or groundwater? And it was a policy decision. It was a policy decision to do that. And the decision to have two different definitions was also a policy decision because of they didn't want overlap of the groundwater public trust and the surface water public trust. And they didn't want overlap because at the time, nobody knew what the groundwater public trust meant. Because no state had ever done that. And so that's why they wanted a distinction between surface water and groundwater for policy. But they also made a decision about the policy for withdrawal because there were bottled water facilities that were drawing.
I get the bottled water and the wanting to control for what might be an aquifer and all of that. In this case, are we trying to mostly measure for flows?
You're measuring for protection of the water quality standards, right? So because that is how the agency right now protects the water quality standards. They have a flow standard. So yes, for me, but right now the default is the flow protection. But
So
it can be more than that.
So for me, if it is for flow protection, there's an argument to be made why springs might be excluded. That's just because most of that looks to me like stuff where there's a potential for runoff and, a brook or stream.
Does it help at all to that point if it maybe not helpful legally, but if it's at springs that surface?
They all?
That's what a spring is.
Right.
You would still have that overlap with the definition of groundwater and the groundwater withdrawal program.
All right, so let's flag that as to be resolved, and let's continue. Mr. Patch, back to you.
Thank you. I didn't mean to start a whole discussion on groundwater versus surface water. I'll explain it simply from the agricultural perspective. Agriculture is excluded from groundwater registration and reporting requirements. And so where springs are included in that definition of groundwater, potentially having to report in this program for that use that is already exempted for agriculture is a bit confusing at the very least, and so I appreciate the discussion on that topic. To address a question that was raised in the introduction of the amendment about, and this isn't language the agency has proposed, it's just informational, section 7 of the required agricultural practices about the exclusion of livestock from waters of the state. A farm must manage that access, but access is allowed both for crossing and for watering. Of course, there are numerous BMP programs that exist to support the exclusion and off-stream watering, but well-managed access for crossing and drinking is allowed. And I just wanted to share that point about the exemption for livestock drinking directly from surface water as found in the H466 as passed by the House. Moving on to the next area, this is for permit requirements that are proposed in the House bill. And this is again bringing up that question of de minimis withdrawals. That current Agency of Natural Resources procedure, recognizes that certain withdrawals are so small in relation to the stream flow, even during periods of drought, that the resulting impact on the natural stream values is negligible. And they also say in their procedure, where in the case where there may be a cumulative impacts of de minimis withdrawals, the agency may require a site-specific review. And so to raise to the committee today that as drafted, H466 was drafted by, or passed by the House, sorry, looking to setting minimum permit requirements, a request that consideration for de minimis withdrawals being articulated as those that the Agency of Natural Resources is not required to permit. And in Mr. Crocker's testimony, there was a line in there towards the end about, intent, and I, certainly, believe that that is absolutely the intent. But as the decades roll on and policy is amended, et cetera, having an understanding or discussion within the committee and perhaps an amendment within the bill to acknowledge that this policy is practicable and is a withdrawal limit that, respective of the cumulative impact question, that it is an allowance that may not require a permit in a future permit program. So this is just example language that may get at that, but that would be the intent of a clause to share or to ask for direction that there are withdrawals that are so small they do not need to be permitted in a future permitting program.
Okay, thank you. I guess while we, again, still have Mr. O'Grady with us, do you have any thoughts on whether or not that seems consistent with the original intent of the bill? And, is this sort of a belt and suspenders approach to expressing that, or is this actually an expansion of what's in the current bill?
I don't know if it does anything. The agency is already required to require a permit based on potential impacts. And you might read the second sentence of Ryan's proposed language as requiring something, so it is not required to permit such withdrawals of water regardless of the natural instantaneous stream flow. But the first sentence is what that second sentence is keyed upon, and the first sentence doesn't mean anything to me. To recognize that certain withdrawals are so small in relation to the stream flow even during periods of drought. Well, that's based on their potential impact. And that's what the agency is supposed to establish in the permitting program. And what is something that is negligible? That's all already built into the directive to the agency. So I don't know if this really means anything.
I'm wondering if the rulemaking would address this.
Well, that's what this is.
Gotta be based on something we understand.
That is what this is basically amending, the establishment of the program. The program is going to be established by rulemaking. I just don't know if it means anything that it's recognized that some withdrawals are so small in relation to the stream flow that the resultant impact on the natural stream bed is negligible. That's in the flow procedure right now, but that was a flow procedure. Right, and it was fairly narrative. Didn't mean a lot to me. And now you're going to say that the permit is not required for that. Well, that could be a vast variation across surface waters. So I don't know if it's really different on the agency than the agency establishing a program based on potential impacts.
Well, so the simple question I have is, how would you know how to evaluate the potential impact if you don't do the measuring to begin with?
Well, there's something called the 7Q10, which is the default water quality flow that can be used as, you don't necessarily need to measure what is predicted as the normal low flow, summer low flow. So you don't necessarily need to measure for surface content.
Okay. So if we wanted, so I guess what I'm a little unclear on is whether this is suggesting, new policy, or this is just, its goal is to be explicit about existing policy. Even if it may not be expressly defined most apt yet, like, is it new policy or just recognizing the status quo? I guess is my question.
Senator Bray, if I may, just the intent is to acknowledge that there is current state policy or procedure adopted by ANR, which provides the allowance for de minimis withdrawals, as well as review for cumulative effects, and that is a good policy, and that a future permit program that regulates surface water withdrawals incorporate an allowance for de minimis withdrawals that would not require a permit.
And that's what you should write in there. The program shall include permit exclusions or exemptions for de minimis withdrawals that are so small that they have negligible impact on the natural streams. It should just be part of the permit program.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so Mr. Patch, do we have your proposal of amendment in electronic form? Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Anything else?
Yes, I just have a discussion point and a question for the committee about the future permit program. And question about, it excludes, I'm not trying to start a fight between sectors or industries, but there's a parity question here between requirements for a permit program. My understanding of permit programs, some ANR programs is that they need to be funded by the applicant or those that are regulated. And so if a farmer is withdrawing surface waters to a degree where the future rule and permit program requires them to apply for and receive a permit of some such to utilize the surface waters on their within or adjacent to their land, that since snowmaking is under a rule that isn't a permit program, that there are no fees associated with either the reporting or registration or review for the snowmaking rule. And so where, it says if there's a change in the snowmaking standards, of maybe saying that wrong within the H466, that they would need to get a permit through this program, then they would come under it. But is there a distinction there that's important to at least consider about requirements for future permits that farmers would have to pay for when, if a current operation or snowmaking operation just continues as normal, they wouldn't be subject to those permits or those fees? And so that's both generally a question for the committee.
Okay, great. Thanks for raising that distinction. All right. Any questions for Mr. Patch? Seeing none, I think I'd like to go on to hear from Mr. Rich, who's been standing by.
Thank you. I would just say overall, I don't disagree with anything that Mr. Patch said. From the farmer's perspective, we very much appreciate the change from 5,000 gallons in one day being a reporting requirement to 5,000 gallons per day averaged over 30 days. That's a significant difference. However, the 5,000 gallon number is still extremely, extremely small. And I'm going to tie this in with the discussion of the current de minimis rules for stream water withdrawals for irrigation. I'm not sure how we keep talking about this de minimis rule, but I'm not sure if people understand the de minimis rule is already tied to the watershed scale. If you are at the top of Appalachian Gap and you're drawing out of this teeny little brook that's only a 1/4 mile long, you can probably pull something like a gallon per minute under the de minimis rules. If you're in Colchester at the mouth of the Winooski, it's probably close to 5 million gallons per day. You know, it already takes into account the size of the watershed that drains to the point of the withdrawal, which makes sense. More water coming down the river means you're going to be causing less harm, relatively speaking, when you withdraw. So for instance, we're on the Huntington River, small, medium-sized river. I'm relatively high up in the watershed. And currently the de minimis rules have it that I can take out 144,000 gallons per day before causing any notable harm to the river. Yet H466, even as modified, still is talking about this 5,000 gallon per day number, which again is like a garden hose running for 24 hours. It's just a very small amount of water to be captured for a regulatory system and for reporting. Again, the de minimis rules state that at this level, we are most likely not causing any harm to the watershed. So therefore, I'm not sure why we're not focusing more on the de minimis numbers when figuring out where the action thresholds are for reporting. Again, the de minimis is tied to where you are in the watershed, how much water flows by you, and then how much you can take out before affecting that. So like I said, at my house, 144,000 gallons per day. Down where the Huntington dumps into the Winooski, it's 2.5 million gallons of water per day before you touch that de minimis threshold. So those are just numbers I think are important to contextualize and seeing where the appropriate action thresholds should be.
I have a question. So I don't think there are, 7 farms like you downstream of you, but so how do we deal with the fact that your de minimis, if there's 7 other de minimis withdrawers, 144,000, what is, now we're up to eight people at 144,000 gallons. What's happening to the Huntington River then? How do we deal with that?
That is an excellent question, and I talk about this with other growers. I do not know the answer to that.
Okay.
Theoretically, if somebody tried to put in 100 acres of irrigated sod just downriver from me where there's currently unirrigated silage corn, that situation could arise. And I think that is important to know where we're at with that. But I, at this point, can't say I have a suggestion for that.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm not
No.
actually against having my water use on the record. I would actually somewhat prefer a situation where I can prove that over, the last 10 years, I've used X million gallons of water, such that in a future water stressed situation, if there did have to be water rationing, I would like to have my fair share. And I think a lot of other farmers share this concern. So Senator Bray, what you brought up is, I'd say maybe a separate conversation, but it is related. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
And one more overall discussion of ponds. So we're high up in our watershed. There are farms that exist higher up in even smaller watersheds for whom the de minimis rules even create a problem for any sort of functional irrigation. I don't know that we should say we don't want any farming in these places because it might be very excellent, productive farmland with good microclimates that might just be short on water. I'd like to see some sort of focus on the fact that ponds in these situations can be extremely beneficial, not only to the farmers, but to the landscape as a way to store water. In our valley, flash floods are a huge problem. We're a very tight mountain valley. Water races off the mountainsides. We get about 60 inches of rain a year here, so we're practically a rainforest. Ponds can actually help to absorb some of that pulse of water and then be used a couple weeks later when the rain taps have been turned off. So it's just an idea that ponds can be a very good solution to the erratic climate we're experiencing. Not to say we should all just be digging ponds all the time, but they can be used well in these situations too, just to piggyback on the conversation that Mr. Patch and Mr. O'Grady were having about.
So practically speaking, how does the, I haven't sort of thought my way all the way around this, so maybe you can help me out. How does the bill influence whether or not someone might say, oh, we do get this flash flooding, I could recharge my pond, and then when I get 3 weeks of dry weather, I can open the pond. How does the bill influence a farmer's choice whether or not they can go ahead and build that pond? Is it silent on it, or?
I would say in general, it would encourage some pond construction just so that the question about water withdrawal quantities can be kind of wiped from the table. If I can irrigate out of my pond that has 3 million gallons of water in it, all these questions of de minimis and 5,000 gallons per day become somewhat moot. But you have to have the right situation in order to have a pond that can actually retain that amount of water, because you can't build ponds in wetlands, and then if you build it on a gravelly ridge, it's not going to have any water in it ever. It'll just drain.
Okay, the 5,000 gallon threshold for reporting, how does, you may know the numbers, well, you certainly know them better than I do. We've heard other states have higher numbers. So if you were to move that threshold up, what seems like what would you offer as sort of a reasonable compromise?
I think the 50,000 gallon number, which was the upper range of the non-metered use reporting threshold, I think that gets us closer in line with states like New York and Massachusetts. I believe New York is 100,000 gallons. Mass, somebody could probably correct me, I think is 50. I don't know if Councilor Grady remembers that number. I have it written down somewhere, but it's not handy at the moment. But
all right, thanks very much.
I just think in our small state with lots of small farms, the current law is going to cause reporting for somebody irrigating 1 acre of drip irrigated vegetables every day for an hour and a half, which is a very, very, very small farm in the grand scheme of things. And remember, especially when you're talking specialty crops, our competition is mostly irrigated deserts in Mexico at this point. So any production that leaves Vermont gets made up for in places where water is even bigger issue. So water is a massive resource for us here. I just don't want to lose sight of that. And we appreciate our access to it.
Yeah, can you say that figure again? Like perhaps how much water is 5,000 gallons? So an acre of drip irrigation.
Drip irrigation, which is extremely fuel efficient. I mean, extremely water efficient. 1 acre of vegetables being drip irrigated for 2 hours will be about 5,000 gallons of water.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any committee questions for Mr. Rich? So if we were, it sounds like the adjustment that you're looking for is an adjustment on the threshold for reporting.
Well, yes, because at the 50,000 number, you're at least getting close to what you're getting closer to what the de minimis rules are already more or less regulating. Again, at our smallish medium river, our de minimis threshold would be 144,000 gallons per day. So when it's at 5,000 gallons per day reporting, we're talking about requiring reporting at 1/30th the de minimis threshold, which, I mean, you're well under 1% of water use at that point. And then on larger streams like the Winooski, the Connecticut, the White River, the West River, it's, there are millions of gallons per day before one would hit the de minimis threshold for potential ecosystem harm, as determined by DEC 20 years ago.
Okay. Your water is very cold and refreshing.
I agree.
You jumped into Bennington Gorge, huh?
Yeah. Okay, so thanks very much for your testimony.
Well, thank you for hearing me.
All right. Obviously, we're going to work on this some more, so we'll be in touch. I also talked to Senator Starr this morning, who chairs Senate Agriculture, and he's interested in seeing what our final work product is, and then I think evaluating it over in that committee as well. So we have a little bit of time. Mr. Carpenter, you're here in the room and an interested party. Do you want to speak to the committee on this?
Just some brief comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You want to join us at the table and
Sure.
read yourself into the record?
So, for the record, Jared Carpenter, Lake Champlain Committee. I don't have any real formal comments, but just based upon, first off, it's nice to sit in this chair for the first time in 2 years. Hello, committee. So some general comments, building on the conversation that was just had. I understand that 5,000 gallons is a low threshold, but building on what you said, Mr. Chair, is the cumulative impact of whether or not there's a dozen 5,000 thresholds on one stretch of river. And really the point would be to collect as much data as possible from all the different surface water users out there. And there seems to be probably an awful lot more than we think. And it seems very likely that then once you get into the pre-rulemaking process, we do support the language that does pre-rulemaking to get all the stakeholders together. Once you get to the pre-rulemaking process, then you can sort out the de minimis, and then you can sort out whether or not who's gonna be required to get a permit and everything. But if you don't collect all the data, you might have gaps on the low ends of the use, particularly on cumulative uses on a smaller stream. I mean, I will completely agree that 5,000 gallons is different on, say, the Winooski River in Cabot versus the Winooski River here versus the Winooski River down in Essex. So, you know, I think all of that, and I don't want to speak for DEC, and I can't speak for DEC, and I'm looking forward to see what DEC says tomorrow. But I would think that would be something that would all wash through in the permitting process, that it would be based on, I mean, I don't know, speculating, somebody on a much smaller river might have to get a permit for a different withdrawals and different factors and different thresholds than somebody who withdraws down in Essex, or, you know, somebody who withdraws up in Tunbridge on the White versus somebody that withdraws down in White River Junction. I mean, you're talking just different standards and different impacts on water.
They're different rivers. I mean,
They're
it's the
different
same river, but they're different
You
stages.
will not be able to do a one size fits all. But I think in collecting the data, you're going to have to sort of cast as wide of a net as possible, just to provide the agency DEC with a good picture, so to speak. And there were a couple more. I do want to hear DEC's comments on Mr. Patch's suggestions, just from, and I haven't talked to my colleagues obviously about it either, but from a first glance, it looks like some of those are really reasonable in terms of, you know, constructed ponds. That is never the intent to capture constructed ponds as part of surface water, and some of the other changes. I think that the de minimis permitting requirements, again, could all be captured in the permitting process and wouldn't necessarily have to be specifically called out in bill language. And the only other one that's coming to mind was a suggestion of Mr. O'Grady's, which was that threshold level of, you know, 5,000 gallons in the case of discussion, averaged over a 30-day period. I don't have a suggestion of language, but can certainly think about that. But the thought would be that somebody on a river could withdraw a tremendous amount of water in 2 days and then not withdraw anything over the rest of the month. And that would, there would be an immediate impact, and then it would drop back down again. So you might have a huge impact on a river system for a couple of days, and then none when you're withdrawing, because you're not withdrawing water out. So I'm wondering if there's a better way of, is it over a 7-day period? Is it a $5,000 withdrawal over 24 hours? If that occurs at any point in 30 days, just concerned that it's not capturing what I think we're trying to capture, but I'll defer to, maybe DEC has some suggested language for that. And thank you very much.
Thanks.
But all in all, thank you so much, and we hope the committee continues to support the effort.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Hart? I had one, I think, back for Mr. Rich. It seems like I still see your square on the screen there. So I get the, you know, we're talking about what that threshold is for reporting. I'm not doing irrigation of crops, so I have no idea what life is like for someone who makes their living that way. Is it the reporting, if the threshold is lower, even though we're talking about, and I think you're making the case that it has a far less than a de minimis withdrawal, is it, so I'm not worrying about the water so much as thinking about the reporting requirement. And is it that it's a time, you know, is it a time concern, like, you know, that you just have to keep logs, and then you'll have to, you know, collate information and then submit a report in January, that it's kind of a pain in the neck and time consuming? if you're, I'm just trying to know what it is that the objection's based on. We're trying to eliminate the expense, and I'm trying to understand, like, if it's 5,000 versus 25,000.
Yeah.
If you're always irrigating and just for the operation of your own business, so you keep track of what you're doing and what fields with what crops, you would record that anyway. Why not record it? And so that's, I don't understand the day-to-day. It's a good question.
Good question. Generally speaking, I think we would only even be hitting a lot of these reporting thresholds during the months of June, July, and maybe August. We pull water out of the river to irrigate tomatoes through drip irrigation in greenhouses, but that uses very little water. Starting now, we're actually planting tomatoes today, and we'll actually pull out of a well today because we're not set up to pull out of the river at the moment. If with the lower threshold, we'd probably have to be paying attention to twice as many months. So it is a bunch of extra paperwork during a time of the year when we're typically not paying as close attention to irrigation. But in the main irrigation months of, late June, July, and August, we have spreadsheets. I have clipboards, and every time we do irrigation, we write down what we've done, where it was. So for me on my farm, it's actually not that hard for me to calculate how much water we did. I know, this block of winter squash takes, 3,000 gallons per hour, and we irrigate it for 3 hours. So I can create those numbers without too much trouble. It's capturing a lot of the really smaller events, like the 5,000, 8,000 gallon a day events, which I think a lot of farmers won't even realize that that's how much they're taking because it's such a small amount. So you're basically capturing more of like the tail ends of the bell curve with that low number instead of the main water withdrawal, which also happens during the driest time of the year. So if you're looking at impacts on waterways, it is that July irrigation that matters because the rivers are lowest and you're taking the most water. Whereas when we're irrigating tomatoes in the greenhouse in 3 weeks and sucking out of the river, the water's up at the top of the banks and we're taking a very small amount.
Okay, and if you were to propose moving that threshold up, so reporting threshold, you would say start at 50,000 gallons a day, averaged over that 30 days.
That would get us in line with a lot of our regional neighbors who don't actually have the water resources we have. Yes, that would be my suggestion. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, any last committee questions for council or for any of our